this ideology is so strong that it's almost got to the point where you can read an article and people don't make any kind of attempt to really defend the idea of autonomy taking priority. It's just taken for granted. It's an assumption which is held to be so intuitively obvious that it doesn't even require any defense. And thirdly, there's a simplistic kind of appeal to this, which is perhaps best represented by an article which is going to come out in the American Journal of Bioethics that I wrote a commentary on with a colleague of mine who was at Keele, is now at UCL. And the claim by David Resnick in this article is that it's wrong of the state to ban trans fat in food. And he uses a traditional kind of pro-autonomy, liberal type argument. So we should all be free to eat trans fat, even though it has no nutritional benefit whatsoever. It can easily be replaced by other things. Really, there's no good reason for it to be in your food at all. And we happen to know that it's extremely bad for you. So my argument here is not that autonomy is not important. You know, like everybody else, I value autonomy. I consider it to be extremely important. What I do want to suggest is that the kind of privileging or the kind of weight that's given to autonomy very often in arguments in medical ethics is failing to notice that there are other kinds of values which, at least some of the time, are going to be equally important, if not actually more important. And thinking about a more pluralistic set of values and what those values actually are, I think is a better way to actually think about issues within medical ethics and then in turn within bioethics. Dogma 2. Voluntary contractual obligations are at the core of medical ethics. What I mean by this is when we think about the doctor-patient relationship, for example, how should we conceptualize that relationship? What kind of relationship is it between a doctor and a patient? And within much medical ethics, there's a view that I call here the consumerist view of social relations. It's an idea that as a patient, I go and see my doctor, and my doctor only has an obligation, a duty to treat me if the doctor voluntarily accepts that he or she is under that particular obligation. So the obligation of a doctor towards a patient comes into existence through consent. And I want to suggest that that's a peculiar notion of how social relations between a doctor and a patient ought to be governed. What I want to suggest is that there are important, what I would call role obligations that attach to being both a patient and a doctor. And they exist prior to the encounter between an individual doctor and an individual patient. So, on my view, just purely by the very fact of being a doctor, in fact, due to the very meaning of what it is to be a doctor, you have obligations to patients, and they exist. They don't come into existence at the moment of you voluntarily accepting them. The obligations attached to being a doctor are not open to individual negotiation. They are just part of the meaning of what it actually is to be a doctor. So one of the consequences of this kind of consumerist notion of the social relationship between the doctor and the patient, which is dominant in much writing on this, is the idea that responsibility for decision making passes from the doctor to the patient themselves. It's left to the patient to decide what they want. So the doctor is the expert in terms of providing information to the patient, but the patient is the decision maker. It's for the patient to decide what he or she wants based upon the information that's given. And I think one of the things that this kind of model fails to take into account is the idea of the importance of the relationship of care which exists, which can be captured by the obligation of this duty to treat, this duty to care, which a healthcare professional has. Okay, and dogma 3 is that law and regulation are central to ethics. Now, I need to be careful here because this is open to misunderstanding. But my thought is that when we think about many debates in medical ethics, and bioethics more generally, there's a tendency to conceptualize these debates in terms of essentially a regulatory issue. So the presumption, because of it, the liberal political philosophy in the background here, the presumption is always in favour of everybody being free to do whatever they want unless there has been some intervention through regulation or the law to actually ban or restrict something. So the presumption's in favour of freedom unless things are banned. And what I want to suggest is that we shouldn't take account of the fact that that's the way that these debates are actually conceptualized. So if you think about things like reproductive technologies, a lot of the debate in that area is about precisely this kind of issues. What kind of regulation can be justified? Now, of course, there's an important issue here, and if we're thinking about the practical implications of bioethics for public policy, it's a vitally important issue to actually discuss. But what I'm interested in is the way that thinking about that issue frames the whole debate about many issues in medical ethics. So a good example of this would be the way that differences between law and ethics can emerge. And at the end of November last year, there was an article in the BMJ written by some anaesthetists about their experience with an advanced directive. And then there was a commentary, there were 3 short commentaries. And one of them was written by Sheila McLean, well-known medical lawyer. And her commentary, it really struck me, was very interesting, and that basically it was, well, the law on this is clear, advanced directives are justified, end of discussion. But the section in the BMJ was actually headed ethical debate. And what struck me was how a lawyer and an ethicist might approach, and in fact do approach, the issue of advanced directives very differently. The legal question is, are advanced directives within this particular jurisdiction, are they legal or not? And if so, what kind of are legal and what kind are not? Whereas an ethicist is perhaps more interested in questions such as, well, we have this interesting empirical evidence that various kinds of advanced directives are problematic. People say that they want an advanced directive, they construct an advanced directive, but then it turns out that they don't really want them to be applied literally. Or in other cases, an advanced directive appoints a proxy, and the proxy decision maker says that in these scenarios they will decide X, Y, and Z, and then you ask the person who has constructed the advanced directive what they actually want in these scenarios, and they say, well, whatever happens, I don't want X, Y, and Z. So there are some interesting issues about how the empirical evidence relating to advanced directives relates to the kind of the more normative issues. And then, of course, there are kind of normative arguments themselves about advanced directives that might link to things like claims about personal identity and whether you remain the same person, and whether an advanced decision has exactly the same kind of moral status as a contemporaneous decision, because, of course, you might, let's assume that you can be fully informed at this particular moment about a decision that you want to make. You certainly can't be informed in advance in exactly the situation that you will be when you're faced with applying the advanced directive, what kinds of factors will be relevant. So what's interesting to me is the way that issues to do with regulation and the law very often frame debates about issues in medical ethics. And of course,